Good afternoon, everybody. Today we are going to start a new book called The Prodigal God by Timothy Keller. Um, the subtitle is Recovering the Heart of the Christian Faith. And he's going to be talking a lot about what he refers to as the gospel. So I'm just going to read a very short introduction just to kind of lay out what this book is about. He says this is a short book meant to lay out essentials of the Christian message, the gospel. It can therefore serve as an introduction to the Christian faith for those who are unfamiliar with its teachings or who may have been away from them for some time. This volume is not just for seekers, however. Many lifelong Christian believers feel they understand the basics of the Christian faith quite well, and they don't need a primer. Nevertheless, one of the signs that you may not grasp the unique, radical nature of the gospel is that you are certain that you do. Sometimes long term church members find themselves so stuck and turned around by a fresh apprehension of the Christian message that they feel themselves to be essentially reconverted. This book then is written to both curious as well as outside and established insiders of the faith, both to those Jesus calls younger brothers and those he calls elder brothers in the famous parable of the prodigal son. So I'm going to turn it over to Lillian, and she's going to read the story of the prodigal son.
Alrighty, so this is found in Luke chapter 15, verses 1 to 3, and then 11 to 32. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him, and that him is Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a far country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out, to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to his father, the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The elder brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'"
Okay, thank you. We have in chapter 1, it's entitled The People Around Jesus. And what Dr. Keller highlights in this parable is it's not about the flight or the return of the younger brother as much as it is about the two brothers, and each of them represent a very different way of being alienated from God and a different way to seek acceptance in the kingdom of heaven. And I think we have some discussion questions that we can address.
Before we go over that, I'm going to kind of clarify the two groups that come to listen to Jesus. So in the parable, it says there's the tax collectors and the sinners. And what he explains these to be is they engage in the wild living, left the traditional mortality of their families and the respectable society, which is explained as the younger son in this parable. And then we have the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They held to the traditional mortality of their upbringing. They were I'm not even going to say that word.
Morality?
Yes, they had morality. They were disciplined in the will of Jesus and their father. And that's where we can see that as the eldest son. And what Jesus is saying is that I'll get into that after we get into a few discussion questions. We have a discussion question that starts, how are the Christians and the organized church similar to the religious leaders of Jesus's day?
Something that I was kind of thinking about with this question, I think with where the religious leaders, the Pharisees, were in their laws, in all of their performance, I see a correlation in that we are creating religious ideas and practices that we think Jesus wants, when in reality, maybe we have not asked God what he would want us to do in our churches and in our personal lives. We practice checklists and rarely make an effort outside of Sunday. I see a lot of that in the organized church. Mm-hmm. It's all about, greeting on Sunday and knowing who's all there. But then there's no discipleship. There's no extra effort being put in. It's all just, we're all going to look good on Sunday. But then act like throughout the rest of the week, God hasn't asked us to do things and sacrifice things and go out of our way to serve somebody else. Sometimes I think that is the reality that we live in, and that's really not what God has called us to do as Christians.
Yeah, I agree. Like almost you follow what you think that you have to follow, almost for some kind of peace prize even sometimes. But I'm going to read something that's on page 11 of this book, and it kind of further explains. Luke summarizes their complaint. This man welcomes sinners and even eats with them. To sit down and eat with somebody in the ancient Near East with a token of acceptance. How dared Jesus reach out to sinners like that? They were saying, these people never come to our services. Why would they be drawn to Jesus' teaching? And these people are upset because they're constantly honoring Jesus, as that's what they say, which could be related to the eldest brother. And I think sometimes that can be almost related to pride almost, because they feel that as they're honoring God, they should also have some kind of token of being honored because they are following the quote unquote God's will or going to church on Sunday, like you said. And it fills them with anger because they are seeing these sinners and the wild living, and they become angry because they're also welcome to sit at the same table they are.
Mm-hmm. No, it absolutely is pride, for sure. And yeah, in that time, it was, there were so many, there was all these classes. And so you had the lowest class were those, what they would call the sinners, and the Pharisees would be the righteous. Yeah. And it was like, we're not even going to associate with them, which is just ridiculous because they're all people, but they had these specific religious rules. And if they were not followed, you were outcast. You weren't welcome to sit at the table.
Right.
But Jesus, throughout his whole ministry, always went to those people that the Pharisees were disgusted by. Mm-hmm. And every time those people accepted him, and the Pharisees were mad about it.
Yeah.
Because Jesus wasn't following their guidelines they put in place.
Right.
which is, yeah.
It kind of reminds me of like Thanksgiving, where there's the kid table and then
Oh,
the
yeah,
adult table.
right.
And the kids aren't allowed to sit at the adult
Right.
table because of X, Y, and Z, when really we're all there for one reason, and that's the family bonding.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good example.
Mhm.
I'm going to mention something from our book we started on last night, Anxious for Nothing. And Max Lucado mentions in there that our belief systems precede our actions. And I think that's so accurate to the modern day church, is we've been taught about traditions, about protocol, and they become so deeply entrenched in our what we think is righteous living that it ends up alienating the very people we're being called to reach out and to disciple.
Mhm.
Okay.
All right. We have another discussion question.
Mhm.
What does the leader's response reveal about their pride? And we kind of talked about this a little bit. I kind of wrote down their indignation and irritation shows that they were never really interested in obedience, only performance.
I completely agree with that. Yeah, just I think it goes with what I just read about how they were so angry that these people were allowed to sit at the same table
Mhm.
they were because they followed certain guidelines that the sinners
Mhm.
did not. And they believed that they were honestly better than they were.
For sure.
Mhm.
And I think that goes with what Ken just said, that your belief system precedes your actions. You can clearly see by their actions that what they believe about God. They don't believe that, these people deserve Jesus or deserve to be in the temple, because at that point they could only access God through the temple. So they didn't think they could come to the temple and worship because they weren't following all the rules.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think about because Jesus is not like that at all.
Right.
He accepts anybody at any time, and he reaches out to them. He wants you to sit with him, and he wants to reveal your disobedience to him, and that's why they're allowed to sit at the table, is because he wants to do what he wants to do good for the sinners that he's done already for the Pharisees, I believe it is. Yeah.
All right. Next question. Why do readers overlook the main underlying purpose in this parable? And I thought this was really interesting because I've read this parable so many times and I for me, I didn't look at it from this perspective. So this book was really, really interesting. This chapter was interesting to me to read and understand the different elder and younger brother perspectives and who that correlates to. So I know the author, Tim Keller, he talks a little bit about how if we just read it in the sense of, oh, Jesus just accepts everyone and it's this younger brother coming back and it's a story of redemption. Part of it is, but I definitely read it that way all the time. I wasn't really reading it in the way of the Pharisees and that disobedience.
Mhm.
So it was really interesting. And I think sometimes when we don't read it with those two brothers in mind, they're only seeing God's love and not his authority over the religious leaders and over just religion and religious behaviors. I think we're losing God's authority over people.
Yeah.
When we only read about that love part.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. And something I wrote down is it's hard to look in that perspective, like you said, because when we are so disciplined with following the morals of Jesus and, Christ and all that, it's hard to look at it in the sense of the younger brother because we almost haven't really put ourselves in that position. And like it mentions later in the book, Jesus' teaching is more attracted to the sinners and the non-religious because it's new. It's something that they've never felt before, something they've never heard before. And so I think it's really easy to overlook the main point that the parable is talking about in the first place, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. All right. Next question. What is the twofold goal of this parable? And I wrote down to reveal. Oh, actually, this is from the book. Tim Keller says to reveal the destructive self-centeredness of the younger brother, but it also condemns the elder brother's moralistic life in the strongest terms.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the 2 points that Keller's trying to make in this parable.
Yeah. Funny enough, I have the same thing written down.
Oh my goodness, would you look at that? It's like we read the book or something.
Yeah, almost. But I have kind of like a short summary for his point here on page 13, because it says Jesus is saying that both the irreligious and the religious, so the religious and non-religious, are spiritually lost. So that's crazy to say, because if you're spiritual, you're like, how am I spiritually lost? Or you're religious, how am I spiritually lost? Because both paths are dead ends. Because he's trying to show things to both the religious and non-religious. It's not appointed to just one. And that every thought that the human race has had about how to connect with God has been wrong. Like Ken said, there's this setup of guidelines that we think we have to follow. And Jesus is never just pointing to one group. He's pointing to all. And I think that's really what he's trying to mention on page 13 specifically.
I think you can go back to Romans to understand that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God.
Yeah.
So everyone has a sin problem. Everyone has a warped view of God and of what worship means and what that relationship with God means, because we're all sinful and we all are tainted with that. And that's why Jesus gives us his word, the Bible, to reorient our thinking into what he would want us to think about and how we should be viewing God as he is.
Yeah.
I think another point in this parable, and it may be as important as the elder brother point, is neither brother was focused on the father.
Mm-hmm.
They were both focused on their own self-centeredness, which we just finished the book, Freedom from Self-Forgetfulness by Tim Keller. And I went back to that book last night to look at some things, and it's like everything he wrote in that book is exactly in this parable. That we all probably on a daily, we all on a daily basis take our eyes off the Father. Because we all are self-centered. We all are pursuing our own plans, if we're honest. And to me, this was just kind of a reiteration of how selfish we are. And whether this was done 2,000 years ago or today, nothing's changed.
Right. Nope. That is amazing that what was written that many years ago is still absolutely applicable today in our lives.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. How does personal autonomy fit in with Jesus's ultimate plan for our lives? And this question, on page 15 in the book Prodigal God, I'm just going to read a little quote here. Tim Keller says, to some degree, the so-called culture wars are playing out these same conflicting temperaments and impulses in modern society. More and more people today consider themselves non-religious or even anti-religious. They believe moral issues are highly complex and are suspicious of any individuals or institutions that claim moral authority over the lives of others. And I thought that was a really interesting quote and perspective, that people are wanting, kind of like the younger brother, where he wanted his own autonomy. He wanted to go out, he wanted his money, he wanted to go out and do whatever he wanted to do with no one telling him how he was going to do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's huge in our culture today, especially with the transgender movements and homosexual movement, where everyone has their own truth and their own morals, and they are very offended if someone comes up to them and tells them that they're wrong, because they're like, how dare you tell me I'm wrong?
Right.
I'm choosing this for myself. This is me. This is what I believe. This is my truth. And I think that's very dangerous when Christians start falling into that perspective as well,
Yeah.
of trying to say, well, this is who I am, instead of saying, okay, who does God want me to be?
Yeah.
Who has God created me to be?
Mhm.
Rather than, well, I'm going to do it my way. They're not even considering Jesus and what he would say about their choices or lifestyle.
Right. Almost because it's like they're not wanting to acknowledge that they're not in control.
Right.
He is.
They don't want that authority.
Right.
They don't want someone telling them what to do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to read the next sentence.
Okay.
It says, despite secularism, or perhaps because of it, the rise of this secular spirit, there has also been a considerable growth in conservative Orthodox religious movements. And that, when I read that again today, I thought, last week I just got an email from Barna Research, which is a organization out in Texas that researches evangelical churches. And they've been on this theme for the last year of Generation Z people that have fallen away from the church. But what they found in the last 9 months is that the percent of Gen Z kids has moved from 34%. It's now back up to 45% of an increase in people of this generation moving back in to those conservative Orthodox places of faith.
Mhm.
So, I mean, this is negative, but it's also, there appears to be a slight trend moving back to truth.
Yeah.
Which I thought was very encouraging.
Yeah, it is encouraging.
Very much so.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yes. Okay. So,
Well, here's something that caught me on page 15.
Yeah.
At the very last paragraph, it says, so whose side is Jesus on? In The Lord of the Rings, which I've never seen.
Well,
which of the
okay,
hobbits-
shame on you.
Yeah, I know. It's on my bucket list,
Okay.
maybe. The Lord of the Rings, when the hobbits asked the ancient T-Bird, whose side he is on, and he answers, I am not altogether on anybody's side, because nobody is altogether on my side.
Mm.
And I think if we go, and that's the exact answer Jesus is giving, that he's on either side of the irreligious or the religious, but he singles out the religious moralism as a particular deadly spiritual condition.
Mm.
But the fact of it is, whether you're irreligious or religious, we're still not seeking him with all we are.
Mhm.
And there lies, I think, that's the central issue.
Yeah.
Because you go back to Proverbs, trust the Lord with all your heart, mind, and spirit. Lead not on your own understanding, but pursue him, and he will make your path straight.
Mhm.
And all of us are very far from that.
Like I think it's Isaiah tells us, all we have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way.
Correct.
And the Lord has laid the iniquity of him. Wait, of us all. What is it?
Lay the iniquity of.
Anyway, it's talking about how Jesus bore our sin because we have all gone astray and sought our own way in our sin and in our unfaithfulness. And God has laid that that penalty of sin on Jesus. And when and Easter's coming up. And so when Jesus, like tomorrow is going to be, a lot of churches are going to be doing a Good Friday service, a time of remembering what Jesus went through for us before the cross, during the cross, and then Easter is going to be celebrating his risen life and that he conquered sin and rose again so that we could have life. So if you're not planning on going to a Good Friday or Easter service, I would highly recommend finding a church near you that you can attend.
Yes. All right. You want to answer question 5? We kind of already went over it a little bit. It says, how do we see society embracing the idea that they have no moral authority over them?
Yeah, we did kind of go over that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It was basically just they almost subside any moral attachment because it's intimidating to give
Yes.
somebody or to acknowledge that somebody else is in control without them.
Yeah, it is intimidating.
Yeah. But now we're going to get into the second part of chapter 1, and that's why people like Jesus but not the church. On page 16, it says Jesus himself was the temple to end all temples, the priest to end all priests, and the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. And what Keller's explaining here is that the people who are religiously observant become offended. They believe they deserve recognition in comparison to those who are estranged from religion and moral observation because they religiously honor God's will.
Mm.
People estranged from religion and moral observation have more attraction towards Jesus' preaching. The outcast connects with God versus the religious person. And then, in my perspective of all this, Jesus reaches the people who need it most. And religious people aren't being discredited, but honoring God's will does not come with a podium.
Valid.
Mm-hmm.
That I like that.
Yes.
I think that's very valid in people when they think, oh, I'm a Christian. I'm gonna go out and do all these things, and I'm gonna get accolades and
Yeah.
recognition.
Mhm.
But in reality, we're called to be humble.
Yeah.
Humbly talk about Jesus and not pridefully.
Yeah. And a lot of the time too, not a ton, but sometimes when I see people seeking Jesus, it's for their own self-improvement, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And not in the way of living for him or living through him or letting him live through you.
Mhm.
It's, I'm going to do it for my benefit.
Yeah.
And that's where you're wrong, because you're not going to be put on a podium and you're not going to get any certain recognition
Yeah.
for it.
And Philippians tells us to look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others, and to put their needs above your own.
Right.
And so seeking Jesus, yes, it does improve who you are and your character and your spirit as you let Jesus change you into who he wants you to be. But it's also then, okay, how do I serve somebody else?
Correct.
How do I take what he's given me and actively use the gifts God gives me? How do I actively use that to help someone else see God?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's the point everyone gets to, but it's just like that ignorance beforehand.
Yeah.
When you don't know. And once you learn, it's within you. And so it's natural that you want to serve somebody else.
Right.
And so it is a learning curve because you have to let him work through you first.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think there's another verse, it's called, and Christ talked about this, that if you are truly wanting to be my disciple, if you seek the approval of men rather than the approval of God, you will not be my disciple.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think we all fall short on that. Because we do want recognition, because we do want to feed our ego. And we've already talked about that in previous podcasts, how competitive our ego is to those around us. And then that goes back to the fallen nature of us. But I think a lot of it is just being mindful. And I think there's just a redirecting of how we perceive things a lot of the time.
Yeah. I think another part of that, why were the estranged from religious and moral observance? Why were those people intrigued and attracted to Jesus? I think they saw authenticity.
Yeah.
Where the religious leaders, they were not, all the outcasts could see was just the habitual daily performance. Where when Jesus came, I think they saw some kind of authenticity in him, where they were like, this is different. This is real. This is impactful. And they could see what he was doing with the people around him, with the miracles and with how he behaved toward the Pharisees. I think there was legitimate reason that they were attracted to his teaching.
Right. Yeah, and I hope this makes sense the way I'm going to explain this, but it's almost like the religious people, it's like they're getting nutrients, and it's every day. They're being plenished every day, and you almost lose, like, forget the value of it. You lose the feeling of value for it. And so when these estranged people are now finding this nutrients and they get it for the first time, it's different, it's new, it's nutritious, and they can see its value a lot more clear than the religious can.
Yeah.
And something that goes along with that, Alexis, is it's always wonderful to look at new believers because they have such a vibrance to them. And then they go into the church and they lose it so much of the time because they're sucked into this standard of rules, regulations, how you should behave, how you shouldn't behave. And so much of the time, it really deadens their spirit, I think, many times. Because I always wonder, because I deal with a lot of non-believers, and I've taken many of them to church. And what I find is how little people come up to even introduce themselves. And if they do, everything is okay. And then if that person decides to come back to that church, it's almost like they can't join the country club because they're not worthy of being in that country club. And I think it's a direct major sin of the organized church in America. And I think that's why you had been seeing such a percent of Generation Z people that aren't coming to church because they're not part of the established country club. And that's what churches have become. And I know that offends people, and I hope it does, because that's what we have become in this country. It's a large country club, and either you're in it or you're not. And I've experienced it a lot in my life where we've gone to a number of different churches, and sometimes it's very difficult to break into that inner circle, even if you don't want to. It's like you got new believers on one side of the pews and the elder brothers on the other side. And seldom are they going to mix.
Right.
And that's the church. That's not the church. That's the organized church.
Right.
The body of Christ isn't like that at all.
Right.
And I think so often we get so confused between what the body of Christ is and what the man-made organized church is in America. And it's, like I said, it's probably going to offend some people. If it does, deal with it.
Well, it's time to wake up, y'all. It's time to get cracking and start doing what Jesus asks us to do. And it's so interesting you bring that up because I was, there was a gathering that I attended, and this gathering was very interesting to me because it was for both. This gathering was for one purpose, but there was a group of people on one side of the room at 4 tables. There was a group of people on the other side of the room at 4 tables, and those two groups did not communicate, even though the two groups were there for the same purpose. There was no relationship. There was no communication. There was no connection, even though there was a reason both groups were there that they were united on. It was so interesting to me to see. It was almost like segregation. And I was like, this is really weird. I don't like this at all. And I was like, I did feel the conviction of the Holy Spirit to go and interact, but I was afraid. And so I didn't. And I do regret that. But it was just interesting to me to see that even though both these groups would claim to be Christians, we were not
Christians.
We were not acting like Christians.
Yep.
And we were not being obedient to what Jesus says and building relationships and encouraging one another and sharpening each other. So that was really an interesting example to me. When you were talking about
Yeah, I want to preface something. Not every church is like this.
Right.
Currently, we have we're in a church right now where we've taken a mother, and she has just been overwhelmingly embraced by the congregation. And that's been so refreshing, especially to my wife and I, because it's so rare that it's happened.
Mhm.
So I want to put a disclaimer out there that they're
Yes.
not all like that.
Yes, that's good.
All right.
Okay, I think
Okay,
we're
I want
good.
to finish. I want to finish with a short excerpt from Alistair Begg. It's entitled "The Man on the Middle Cross," and I think it fits in so well with this first chapter. So I'll read it here, and hopefully I will not mess up too badly. A phone call came into a church office, and a man was requesting an urgent visit. He was due to go into a hospital for heart surgery and wanted to talk to the pastor before he did so. So this pastor set up a time to go over to the man's apartment. And when he went to the apartment, it was in a state of disarray, messes everywhere. And the man was in his late 60s. He was in very, very poor health. But the man explained that he had grown up in a Christian home, but he walked away from the faith and spent his life gambling and drinking. And his choices had finally caught up with him. And he was scheduled to go into open heart, or actually a heart transplant in the next week. But he wanted to speak with the pastor because he desperately wanted to know if it was possible for someone like him to get right with God after he had made such a mess of his life. The pastor opened his Bible and shared the story of a man who had similar questions at a crisis point in his life. The man who had also made bad choices was now reaping the consequences. This particular man had fallen into a life of serious crime. He had been sentenced to death by crucifixion, one of the most painful punishments ever conceived, and was hanging on a cross. Nearby, a second criminal was enduring the same punishment. And then there was a third man between them, Jesus of Nazareth. And above Jesus' head, someone had nailed a handmade sign, "This is the King of the Jews." As the soldiers and onlookers stood by, some shouting insults, some just in silence, hanging there in agony, the second criminal scoffed bitterly at Jesus and said, "Aren't you the Messiah? Why don't you save yourself and us?" But the first criminal spoke quietly, his words barely more than a whisper. And he said, "Don't you fear God?" He said, "You and I deserve this. We're guilty, but this man has done nothing wrong." Turning his face as best he could, he said to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into my kingdom, when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus spoke directly to him. "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." We often think of this thief on the cross. Let's just imagine for a minute his name is Reuben. And I'm looking forward to one day meeting him in heaven to ask him, "How did that shake out for you, Reuben? Because you never got time to go to a Bible study. You never got baptized. You never knew a thing about church membership. And yet Jesus promised you paradise. You made it. What happened?" And I imagined him stepping hesitantly into the splendor of heaven, still dazed but gloriously free from the agony of the final moments on earth. And he had taken an uncertain step, but his feet no longer bound by nails, his body now whole, but his mind was still catching up. A majestic figure approaches him. His eyes were sharp and yet kind. And the angel asked him, "What are you doing here?" And Reuben responded. He didn't respond. And the angel the second time asked him, "So what are you doing here?" And Reuben then responded, "I don't know." The angel frowned slightly. "What do you mean you don't know?" "I mean, I don't know," Reuben said. His voice faltered. What can he say? He had nothing to offer, no list of good deeds, no great acts of faith. The angel said, "I think I better go get my supervisor." So he went and got his supervisor, and he said, we got somebody new here. And the senior angel nods and said, right, then we better go through the checklist. First, he asked Reuben, are you clear on the doctrine of justification by faith? Reuben scratched his head and said, the doctrine of faith, what? I've never heard of that in my life. And the angel's wings twitched, but he remained patient. Never mind, he said, what about baptism? When and how were you baptized? And Reuben shifted uncomfortably and said, I wasn't. Then there was a long pause. The angels exchanged glances. And finally, the senior angel asked, then on what basis are you here? Reuben's face softened as though remembering something too wonderful for words. His voice, now calm and steady, said, the man on the middle of the cross said I could come. The man on the middle of the cross said I could come. And that's the point, isn't it? It's an astonishing truth that shattered religious expectations then and still does today. Reuben didn't have time to go to Bible study, to go to church, to get baptized, to tithe. He didn't have time to do any of these things that most people then and now associate with being religious. And yet Jesus promised him a place in heaven. No theological tests, no religious achievements, because heaven isn't earned. It's a gift. It's a pure grace from start to finish, unfiltered, unearned, and freely given. And I want to close with that, because that's what tomorrow is. It's Good Friday. And it's to remember that what Christ did through his atoning sacrifice for us, and we can't earn our salvation, it's a gift that he gave to us. And he gave it to this man who hadn't practiced religiosity in his entire life. Now, the other part of this story is the man that was going to have a heart transplant went into the hospital and remembered this story, and he asked Christ if he would remember him. And 30 minutes later, he died on the table. But he's in heaven today. So I think it's a good reminder for all of us church people that it isn't what we've done. It's not the influence we've had or what we've accomplished. It's the gift of salvation that Christ has given to those that will believe and receive it. So on that note, if you guys don't have anything else to add, we'll close for tonight. Alexis and I will be back tomorrow to review Anxious for Nothing that we started Tuesday evening. We'll be going through some questions and just doing a kind of a review of what we talked about. Mm-hmm. So may you all have a blessed evening, and remember tomorrow.
Yes.